Welcome back. It's very, very good to see you. Everything we have talked about this semester, and everything you hear about in terms of wealth and poverty, is based in large part on measurements, on data. But this course is also about power. And one of the most obscure ways power is exercised in any society has to do with what is measured and what is not measured, and how various important things are measured. To be very explicit about it, recently we learned that the consumer price index has been rising very fast. In fact, between March of this year and March of last year, the consumer price index increased by 8%. That's a huge increase in inflation. We also know, because we measure it, that the employment cost index, that is wages, have been going up, not quite as fast, about 5.4 to 5.6%. So you can conclude from those two measures that although there is dramatic inflation and there is wage inflation, wages are actually dropping by about 2.7% per year over the past year, in real terms, adjusted for inflation. And we also know that unemployment looks like it's down because there's a report monthly from the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the Labor Department. All of these reports come from government agencies. There is no government report on profits. And there's no government regular report on corporate concentration. Now, it should be interesting to you, it has been interesting to me to note that there's no government report on profitability. I mean, this is an economy that runs by profits. Profits are the lodestar by which we measure success of companies. There is no agreed upon regular government report on profits. If you want to understand profits, you've got to go both to the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service records, in which every company has to report its profitability. But you also can, if you want, go to the Securities and Exchange Commission, where corporations have to report to their shareholders, if they're publicly held corporations, on what their profits are. And they have to report to Wall Street. But do you know there is a discrepancy? That is, corporations very often want to show that they're highly profitable to their shareholders, but they want to minimize their profits to the IRS. So what that means is that the media and economic researchers have a lot of data about wages, a lot of data about prices, a lot of data about unemployment, but very little about profitability and very little about economic concentration. So what does that mean in turn? That means that when you see something going on in the country, like prices increasing, and you're a researcher or you are in the media and a reporter, what are you going to do? You're going to rely on the data that is available in a timely way, and that's data on unemployment and on wages. So it's very easy to conclude that wages are very high and because unemployment is low, and that's driving inflation. Because you don't see and have data readily available on profits or concentration. And as we have seen in this course, profits and industrial concentration are both quite important. We'll come back to this. All right. Today, we're going to be focusing on climate injustice or climate justice or environmental justice. There are a lot of words for it. And I added this particular unit a couple of years ago because so many students were interested in climate and climate change, worried about climate change for very good reasons, but also didn't understand or were curious about the effects of climate change on the topic of this course, which is widening inequities and inequalities of wealth and income. And so I thought, well, we should find out about that. And then I thought, well, why not add it right after the week that we talk about health? Because they go together. Okay, today's outline. Health, wealth, and the environment in the East Bay. I was looking for a bridge between what we talked about last week in terms of health and what we're going to talk about this week in terms of the environment. And the overlap, it seems to me, was, and the best overlap and easiest overlap was really to look around us. So we'll do that first, and then where to locate toxic and dirty industries, and then adapting to climate change, and I'll tell you what that means, and then mitigating climate change, and we'll talk about what that means. But again, we're going to be looking at this all through the lens of wealth and poverty, distributional justice or injustice, depending on your own values. Climate justice equals social justice. Well, a few years ago when I saw this, it sounded probable to me, but I didn't know exactly analytically what it meant. I could imagine. But one of the goals today is to give you more information and analysis so you can clarify your own thinking. I'm not going to tell you what to think, obviously, but so you can clarify and think more deeply about what this means, certainly in the context of this course. The life expectancy in the East Bay, and we talked about this a little bit, I touched on it last time. Life expectancy in the East Bay varies by about 10 years, depending upon where you live or were born or spent most of your life. 10 years. You can see here, and we're looking mostly at Oakland and the areas around and south and east of Oakland, but you can see where life expectancy is lowest. And you can see here where life expectancy, relatively speaking, is much higher, 10 years. Now, you know the geography, most of you, and you can see, by the way, the island of Piedmont. We've already talked about that. One of my goals, by the way, in these last sessions we have together, is to integrate more and more of what we have talked about, what we've learned, so you can see the layering, how one has to do with another. The highest incidence of lead paint poisoning in the East Bay. Now, obviously, a health issue and an environment issue, it overlaps. But you can see here and also here. Again, there's an overlap in terms of mortality. And that shouldn't be a surprise. We're looking at lead paint poisoning. Highest incidence of asthma in children. Where do we see it? Well, in the East Bay, at least. We're seeing it in the south of Emeryville and to the west in terms of Oakland. And we can see it a little bit here in these areas. Overall, the zip codes that have the highest rates of hospital admissions for asthma per 10,000 children, and this is 2010, the data, the more recent data we have is pretty similar. Shows Barstow, Emeryville, Oakland, Modesto, Oroville, and so forth. Children did not volunteer to live in these places. This is environmental. It's also health. The environment and health overlap pretty dramatically. What about nitrogen dioxide, NO2, pollution? Well, the latest data we have, and by the way, this is quite poisonous. I mean, nitrogen dioxide is a poison. You don't want to get too near it, and you don't want to get to it in a purified form, but you can see where it is the highest level. And by the way, not incidentally, these were once redlined neighborhoods. So there is the further overlay of racism, officially sanctioned racism, the history of redlining, which we've talked about in this course, but look at how directly it connects. So one thing I would like you to do today is bear in mind the relationship between three vectors. One vector is racism, the other vector is politics, and the third vector is economics. And we're going to see in terms of environmental or climate justice or injustice, how those three vectors interact. Most endangered by violence. We talked about this a little bit last week. Number of violent crimes, burglaries, arrests. Again, West Oakland. What about accessibility of supermarkets? We talked about this too last week. And this is in the East Bay. How far do you have to travel to get to a supermarket? Well, the green areas indicate you've got to travel a mile to get to a supermarket, or at least a half mile. If you can't get to a supermarket, what do you do for food? Chances are you rely on fast food. And what about COVID? As of April 2021, you can see almost the same pattern. Now, why would that be? Why is there so much overlap? What's a major cause of higher COVID incidence in these places? Is it A, more people per household, that is extended families and friends, or B, just simply lack of health care, or C, more smoking, asthma, and other bronchial ailments in these places which foreshadow a more susceptibility to COVID? Or is it adults in these areas are more likely to have to continue to work, often at risk of contracting the disease? What do you think? Well, most of you think it's that adults in these areas have to work. They have to expose themselves. They can't work remotely. And this was in 2021. And that is obviously a very large issue. But let's see if we can find any data on this. Crowded neighborhoods, crowded living corners also have a big role to play. COVID cases per 10,000 residents by housing density. More than 1,000 occupied homes per square mile. Housing density, but it's not just housing density. It's obviously also the number of people in a house. But what you do is you combine a lot of these factors, because if you've got a lot of people who are living together and one or two or several of them have to go to work and expose themselves in work to COVID, then you've got a double whammy. COVID-19 more prevalent in zip codes where median household income is less than $35,000 a year. And in these neighborhoods, you've got people who are living either closely together or crowded together. There is not much opportunity to separate. Why do the poor live in the unhealthy and unsafe parts of the East Bay? Is it A, they don't know they're unhealthy and or unsafe, so better information would help, or B, public authorities don't adequately enforce health and safety laws in these areas, so better enforcement would help. Or C, housing is cheapest in these areas, so better access to safer, affordable housing would help. Or D, black people are pushed into unhealthy areas. What do you think? Go. Well, most of you, 67% of you, think housing is cheapest in these areas, so better access to safer, affordable housing would help. The fact is, the highest correlation in all of the dimensions we've looked at is to the cheapest housing. The poor live where housing is cheapest because, duh. This is not rocket science. And housing is cheapest in these areas because there are safety issues that are either explicitly understood or not explicitly understood. But if you're next to a highway and there is a lot of ambient exhaust that aggravates or causes asthma and has a lot of nitrogen dioxide in the air, well, that's obviously going to affect property values directly or indirectly. So again, what I want you to understand is that wealth and poverty are highly correlated with not just what you can afford, as we've seen over and over again, but what you can afford is correlated with how healthy you are in terms of whether you see a doctor, where you live, what kind of support you get. This is not true of every society. Modern societies, rich societies, have different norms. In the United States, we tend to be quite individualistic. We tend to, as I have talked about before, believe in the notion that individuals determine their own fates, and therefore, if somebody chooses to live in an unsafe place or chooses to live in an unsafe environment, that is their prerogative. We don't examine the word choice. Some of this is the direct legacy of racism systemically, as I talked about a moment ago, but I came across this. This is neighborhood grades. In 1930, the government and San Francisco's own local government put out grades for the best, the still desirable, declining, and hazardous places to live in the East Bay. I thought it was interesting. This is early 1930s. So this is when we were in the Depression as a country. This is when almost everybody was poor or suddenly became poor. So this is the hazardous area to live in if you're in Berkeley. There's the campus. It's not very hazardous. But here is Berkeley. The places that are the best are in the hills, obviously. And then you have the declining areas of Berkeley, interestingly, just north of campus and just south of campus. And then you have some still desirable areas, but desirability, neighborhood grades, hazardous and best, well, they were based upon notions of safety, but also very much notions of who's going to move in and who's moving out. Race. The percent people of color, if you look fast forward, the most recent we have, good data, what you see is, again, as I showed you before, the redlined areas are the same areas that we saw in the 1930s. What strikes me is how stable this systemic system is. It's not as if it's changed dramatically. I was expecting, even by 2010, that there would be huge change in terms of gentrification. Maybe there has been, latest data we have, but maybe there has been. This morning I went to 4th Street in Berkeley to do a little shopping. Well, 4th Street looks pretty gentrified to me, but I'm told it's really not as gentrified as I think it is. The COVID-19 infection rate is nearly 5 times higher in neighborhoods with majority non-white residents than in neighborhoods where non-white population is less than 10%. Now, as I've said before, it's important to remember that Black people and Latinx people are disproportionately poor. But most people who are poor are not Black people or Latinx people. Most people who are poor are still white people. I remind you of that because it's very easy particularly in political terms, given how we divide in this country, to assume that because Black people and Latinx people are disproportionately poor, that they are the majority of the poor. Which gets us to a second aspect of environmental or climate justice or injustice, and that is where to locate toxic and dirty industries and activities. Now, one reason that the west part of Berkeley and Oakland are as toxic as they are is that very dirty old industries used to be located in West Berkeley and West Oakland. That's where you got a lot of the environmental damage, the legacy of that dirty industry. They aren't there anymore, but they've left a lot of their dirt behind. But there's a lot of new decision-making about where to locate toxic industry. In 1982, Warren County, North Carolina. I don't know if this rings a historic bell to any of you. I think it should. It was the siting of a PCB landfill in a mostly Black community. PCBs are toxic. Protests and over 500 arrests of Black people in Warren County, North Carolina. The siting of hazardous waste landfills and their correlation with racial and economic status of the surrounding communities. And this is a report from the General Accounting Office. It's now called the General Accountability Office of the United States. A report found that in the 8 states studied, 3 out of 4 commercial hazardous waste facilities were located in mostly Black neighborhoods, even though the region was only 20% Black overall. Is this racism? Is this economics? Is this politics? What's the blend? Abandoned uranium mines on and near the Navajo Nation, abandoned, highly toxic. Why are they there? What's the blend of racism, economics, and politics? I'll get to this, actually. I'm not going to just leave it totally up in the air. Take a look at Washington, D.C. Now, I don't know how many of you know Washington. Washington, D.C. is this area here. It was created as a compromise because a lot of Southerners at the time of formation of the country wanted to get the capital out of Philadelphia, and they chose a swamp next to the Potomac River. It was really almost uninhabitable, and it's still a swamp. And having lived there for many years, I can tell you it's still uninhabitable for different reasons. But what you ought to know is that this is Northwest Washington. Now, this is most people who work in the high levels of government live in Northwest Washington. This is obviously Northeast, this is Southeast, but those quadrants, Northwest, Northeast, Southeast, tell you a lot about poverty and about race. Now, when I lived in Washington, I lived exactly there. If you look closely, you can see me. But why is a trash incinerator, a major trash incinerator, why is it right here? Again, my question to you, racism, politics, or economics, we'll get to that. Who's closest to the greenhouse gas emitting facilities in California? Not surprisingly, the percent of people of color versus white, number of these kinds of greenhouse gas emitting facilities within 2.5 miles, you can see mostly people of color, mostly poor. Why is that? Why is this happening? Is it A, poor communities, disproportionately Black, Latinx, or Native American, have little or no political power to stop these projects? Or B, they need these projects for jobs and income? Or C, they don't know their health is being compromised? What do you think? Well, overwhelming, you say they don't have political power to stop these projects. And there's a lot of evidence that you are right, because with poverty goes relatively low degrees of political power. Now, we've talked about this. We've spent at least 2 weeks talking about the relationship between wealth and power. You know the dynamic here. If you are poor in America, or if you're in the bottom half, you don't even have to be very poor, you don't have very much voice. You're not making campaign contributions. You don't have connections. You don't really know how the system works. You're not being listened to generally. In 1984, the California Waste Management Board, a board that was trying to decide where to put the waste, where to locate waste disposal facilities, they hired a management consulting firm, Carell Associates, to define communities that would not resist the siting of noxious facilities, or what they came to. I love every time you see an acronym. You know, you ought to watch your wallet, or watch your moral compass, because acronyms very often, particularly in areas where we're dealing with distributive justice, they hide what is really going on. So this acronym is locally undesirable land use. But instead of saying locally undesirable land use, we're saying undesirable or kind of crappy places or dangerous places. They had said LULUs, L-U-L-U-S. So where, and if you want to hide your own responsibility, you hire a management consulting firm. Because you can always say, well, we didn't make this decision. The management consulting firm. We used expertise. And they found communities that would not resist, or basically locally undesirable land use, or LULUs. And the report of terms of trash incinerators in California, I thought this was interesting, because this is the kind of thing where it all begins. The least likely to resist were the southern and Midwestern communities, rural communities, open to promises of economic benefits. And by the way, Sorrell Associates report, they were not just looking at California, they were obviously looking at the entire United States, and open to promises of economic benefits, basically conservative, Republican, or free market, above middle-aged, high school or less education, low income, Catholics, not involved in social issues, old-time residents, nature exploitative occupations, farming, ranching, mining. Those were the criteria that they used in their polls. And what else? Most likely to resist, the northeastern, western California. Urban communities don't care about don't care where the benefits are minor. Liberal Democrat welfare states, young and middle-aged, college-educated, middle to upper income, other activists, residents for 5 to 26 years, professional yuppies, and whatever housewives then meant. So applying their scientific criteria, that's what Sorrell Associates told the California board that was trying to figure out where to locate toxic dumps in California. And so, not surprisingly, what we found in California is we have a legacy of a lot of this stuff being dumped in, as you saw, communities that meet those criteria, because they're not going to put up much of a fuss. Political power or lack of power becomes incredibly important in terms of understanding environmental injustice. But there's something else besides that. And it has to do with economic analysis. There's a fellow named Larry Summers. I don't know how many of you know or have heard of him. I've mentioned him a couple of times. I worked with him. In fact, not only did I work with Larry Summers, but in 1992, right after Bill Clinton was elected president, and he asked me to run his economic transition. And he asked me to round up people who had worked on his campaign, who knew a lot about economics. And I knew Larry. Larry and I were colleagues at Harvard. Larry and I debated each other a lot. In the 1980s, I was advocating something called industrial policy, which is basically revealing all of the subsidies that powerful industries were getting and determining that it was insane to give the old coal and oil and steel industries a lot of subsidies. What we wanted to do, if industries were getting subsidized, is look at the social benefits and social costs and move the subsidies to where the social benefits were highest. Well, Larry thought that that was ridiculous, and we debated that through the 1980s, but I was always impressed with his thinking. He became the head of the World Bank, or not the head of the World Bank, he was the chief economist for the World Bank. And the question that he was asked by the World Bank to examine is where to locate dirty industries in the world, where to put toxic waste around the world. And then the title of this report was, shouldn't the World Bank be encouraging more migration of the dirty industries to the least developed countries? What was the logic? This was a kind of rhetorical question. He was recommending, as the chief economist of the World Bank, that the World Bank put more of the world's dirty industries, or encourage more of the world's dirty industries to go to the poorest countries. What is the logic? Is this because of Sorel Associates? They're not going to have very much power in the United Nations or in the global political system? No. The logic actually had two parts. Part one was the measurements of the costs of health-impairing pollution depends on the foregone earnings from the increased deaths. So a given amount of health-impairing pollution should be done, obviously, in the country with the lowest cost, which will be the country with the lowest wages. Do you understand the first part of that logic? Or to restate it, what Larry Summers is saying, if these are poor countries, the lost income is going to be much lower than if you put them in rich countries. Because rich countries are rich. Hello? And so if you impair the health of people in rich countries, that's going to cost a lot. If you impair the health of people in poor countries, it's not going to be very costly. They're poor already. And then he also said, the demand for a clean environment is likely to have very high income elasticity. The concern over an agent that causes a 1 in a million change in the odds of prostate cancer, for example, is obviously going to be much higher in a country where people survive to get prostate cancer than in a country where under 5 mortality is 200 per thousand. Translated, put the dirty industries where people don't live very long, because they're already dying at a very young age. You're not going to have to sacrifice very much in terms of their lost years. They don't live that long. Al Gore was vice president. Bill Clinton summoned me to the Oval Office. He was just getting started, and I had this economic team already in mind, and I thought Larry Summers, well, I didn't know about this memo, but I thought Larry Summers, I thought his mind was analytic, and we disagreed, but why not have him on the team? Bill Clinton said, you've got to convince Al Gore. Al Gore really doesn't like this guy. So I walked into Al Gore's office, and I said, I know you have reservations about Larry Summers, but And Al Gore stopped me and he said, "Did you see this memo that he wrote when he was chief economist of the World Bank? I mean, this is ludicrous. This is economic logic carried to its worst possible conclusion. If you applied this logic around the United States, it would exacerbate inequality. It would be unjust. Why should we do this worldwide?" And I spent the half hour trying to argue with Al Gore. And then I went back to Larry and I said, I need an explanation. What is this memo all about? Because Al Gore just doesn't like what you did. I don't like it either. And Larry said, "Well, I didn't really write it." I said, "How can you not write it if your name is on it? You were the chief economist of the World Bank. Your name is right." He said, "It always happens. It happens. It happens. Somebody who was much younger wrote it, and I didn't really read it. I should have read it, put my name on it, and it went out." And I went back to Al Gore and I told him, and then I spent another half hour. And finally, Al Gore relented. He said, "If you and the president really want this guy, okay, but I just want you to know I don't trust him." So Larry Summers joined the economic team. And after 8 years, he became Secretary of the Treasury of the United States. And under Obama, he continued as the chief economist of the United States, of the president, and he almost became the chair of the Fed. Oh, and between times, he was president of Harvard. And as president of Harvard, he made a speech in which he said, not pertaining to the environment, but he said, women, they are not dominant in sciences or math, possibly because their brains are not designed for it. He was fired from Harvard. Not from Harvard, but from the presidency. And I debate him all the time. I still debate him. But I go into this little anecdote because I want you to know that behind all of this are people, real people, not just people who are being affected by analysis, but people who are actually creating these analyses. So what should the response be with regard to toxic industries? A, inciting toxic industries, including storage of toxic waste, reject efficiency analysis based on current distribution of income and health. Or B, cite them where there are no people. Or C, leave the decision up to local people most likely to be affected. Or D, stop all toxic industries and activities. Let's see what you think. Well, most of you say stop all toxic industries and activities. Well, that would be nice, I suppose, but you've got to be aware of the costs and also have a pretty good idea of what you mean by toxicity, because a lot of things have negative health consequences to some extent, like driving. Rejecting efficiency analyses based on current distribution is an interesting one, because most economic efficiency analyses depends on current distribution. You start with a baseline that is where people are right now relative to each other in terms of their income or wealth distribution. Maybe we should get away from that, particularly in the area of the environment. Cite them where there are no people, a little bit difficult to do since there are people almost everywhere. And people need places, and people are moving into places, and a lot of areas of this country don't have enough places for people to live as it is. decision to local people most likely to be affected. And the problem there should be obvious. Many places around the world and even in the United States need money. They need industries, and there are places, even in the United States, that will accept a lot of garbage because that is the way they earn money. So this is all, as many of my questions to you are, it's really to stimulate your thinking about how difficult and complex something is, which gets us to adapting to climate change. Now, when I say adapting, I want to draw a distinction in your minds between adapting and mitigating. And this is something that not enough people are talking about, because it has a huge bearing upon this course, upon distributive justice. There's a lot of talk, obviously, about mitigating, that is, reducing the total amount of gunk in the atmosphere, reducing climate change overall. There's a Paris Agreement we'll talk about in a minute. There's all kinds of attempts to do that, but in the meantime, people have to adapt. They will adapt. If they don't adapt, they will get sick or they will die. The climate is changing. In California, there are more wildfires. There's more smoke. We know we're living in it. Some people are losing their lives. Some people are losing their homes. Some people are scared. It has health effects. We are adapting, quote unquote, to the extent that we are able to. But the we in we are adapting is the interesting and major issue. Who is we? How easy is it to adapt? Who can adapt easiest? That is where the issue of wealth and poverty come in. Adaptation, reduce the negative consequences of climate change. Mitigation, reduce climate change. What are the consequences for rich and poor? And the trend is pretty obvious. We all know it. This goes up to 2020, but we could just continue. And reports come out, and what amazes me, it's kind of interesting to me as an observer of politics and sociology, is how the reports get more extreme and people's experience becomes more frightening, and yet the politics really doesn't change very much. Natural disasters are more frequent and their costs are also growing. This is only up to 2019. By the way, some scientists connect pandemics to climate change. And one of the most frequently cited connections is that in evolutionary terms, animals and animal species and humans have, over thousands of years, learned to adapt to each other. But as climate change occurs, animals and human beings, I guess we're animals too, various species of animal, including human beings, they are moving. Animals are moving. And that movement puts animals and people together in ways that we have not yet adapted to, and therefore there is more possibility of transmission from animals to people. Well, I don't really know. I'm not a scientist in terms of the climate or epidemiology, so you'll have to just look into that. Selected significant climate anomalies and events, just to take January 2020, all over the world. The warmest on record, the coldest on record. You know this. You see this. You read about this all the time. You experience it here in California. The Arctic is melting. Antarctic is melting. I should say the Arctic is actually becoming, interestingly, a center of geopolitical tension. Because with Russia becoming more aggressive openly, who is on the Arctic? Well, the United States and Russia. We basically face the Russians in ways we have not faced Russia before. So as the Arctic melts. That is another thing to keep in mind. Major disasters across the United States. Well, this is just 2018, but Western wildfires. By the way, in 2020, how many of you, do you remember waking up to an orange sky? I remember it was already pretty bleak in terms of COVID. And I woke up at the normal time and I said to my wife, I think it's night. I think we woke up in the middle of the night. And she said, no, it's not night. It's morning. And you remember it was dark and then it started to get light, but it got orange instead. I think that's when a lot of people who I know began saying, something fundamentally is wrong. California wildfires, well, I don't even want to talk about it, but I will. I mean, there is an interesting question about whether this state or this region is going to be habitable in 20 years, 30 years. I can tell you that in 30 years, you are likely to be here. I am not. One thing the baby boomers, of which I am an early one, did or failed to do is to protect or make sure that the late boomers or the millennials or the Gen Zs are all in basically good condition and well protected and well positioned for the future. I think that the boomers, and again, I'm one of the boomers, I have standing to say this, have not done a terribly good job in terms of a legacy, leaving to you guys a world that we didn't exactly destroy, but have not left it in a way I would have wanted to leave it to you. Can I just say that? I don't have to say anymore. Those of you, one more thing. Many of you tell me or write me, the world is going to hell. Well, it may be. But I often, whenever I hear that, I think back on when I was a senior in 1968. And when I was a senior in college, Martin Luther King was assassinated. And I just couldn't believe how this country could manage. And then there were riots in our cities. And then I was in the campaigns in 1968. I was trying to help George McGovern become a candidate. And Bobby Kennedy in California, I was here in California, he was assassinated. And then Hubert Humphrey became the Democratic candidate. Lyndon Johnson was getting us deeper and deeper into Vietnam. My friends were being drafted into Vietnam. I was drafted to go to Vietnam. Well, I was out here in California because I was working on the campaign. Bobby Kennedy had just been shot and killed. I had worked for Bobby Kennedy the year before. I was working for Eugene McCarthy, and he was shot and killed, Bobby Kennedy, and then I got my draft notice. And I looked up the rules, and the rules said that if you were under 5 feet tall, you will not be drafted. And I thought, praise be. So I went to the Oakland Induction Center. That was the closest induction center. I went to the Oakland Induction Center, and I showed up. Nobody was around. The Oakland Induction Center, by that, was a scene of a lot of demonstrations and some violence. But the day I went, nobody was around, and I walked down. I remember walking down the corridor, and there was one sergeant at the desk, far in the distance. And as I walked toward him, I thought, no problem. I'm gonna get out of here. Boom, zingo. And he got a big smile on his face, and he said, just write your name down here and your address and everything. I did, and I smiled at him, and he said, perfect. I said, what's perfect? He said, you are perfect. And my heart started to beat. I said, why am I perfect? He said, because we have been looking for tunnel rats. I said, tunnel rat? Yes. He said, tunnel rats to flush the Viet Cong out from under the rice paddies to go into the tunnels. You are ideal. And he said, come with me, let's measure your height. And at this time, I really was seeing my entire life move before my eyes. And then we measured, he measured, you know, when you know, you stand and you look out and the height thing comes down. And I knew I was under 5 feet tall, but I didn't know whether he would write me down as under 5 feet tall. And I felt his hand on my shoulder, and he said, I'm sorry, son. And then I didn't know why he was sorry. Was he sorry because I couldn't become a tunnel rat? Was he sorry because I was too short? And then I said, yes. And he said, you're too short. And then I didn't know whether to yell, hooray, to leap, or to just keep it very, so I did. I said no to myself. I said, I'm not going to act this out. I'm not going to jump for joy. I'm just going to, because he could get annoyed. And I'm just going to be very, very modest, kind of downcast. And I looked kind of down. And then he said, but. And I thought, oh, I overdid it. I looked too downcast. He's going to be, I said, no. He said, but. He said, don't give up trying. Maybe you'll grow. And I walked out into the warm sunlight of that Oakland day. And I was not going to Vietnam, but many of my friends went, and I lost some to that war. And that war was hell. And it was not just the assassinations and the riots and the war. It was the whole country was coming apart. I mean, it was literally coming apart. We feel like today the country is coming apart. At my graduation, you know, when we had a graduation speaker who said, don't go to Vietnam. He told the entire class, don't go to Vietnam. This was the valedictorian of my senior class. He said, come with me, because immediately after this graduation, I'm going to Canada. And then all the parents in the audience kind of screamed, and some of them started punching each other. I mean, there were fist fights. And and then, who's elected president? Richard Nixon. I could go on. 1968, I thought, was the bottom. You could not get lower. And I was fortunate to win a scholarship to go to England, and we took a boat, all of us. We took a boat together. All of us who won this particular scholarship. And I was so glad to leave America. I thought, this place is sinking. This boat is not sinking, but this country is sinking. And then on the boat, in the stateroom, when everybody else, it was a very rough passage, and everybody else was sick, I managed to get to the stateroom, and because I just wanted to walk around, and there's this one older man in the corner. And I thought I recognized him. And I went up to him and I introduced myself. I said, what is your name? He said, my name is Bobby Baker. Now, you don't remember Bobby Baker. Bobby Baker had been an advisor to Lyndon Johnson and had been shown to be quite corrupt, taking bribes. And I thought to myself, here I am going to Europe, trying to escape America, and this bacillus of corruption is coming with me on the ship. So when you think about now, and you think that this is a terrible time, there have been terrible times before. And your grandparents or great-grandparents, or maybe even great-great-grandparents, like my parents, went through 1939, 38, 1940, 41, Hitler, World War II. It's not as bad as it gets. Believe me. So, mitigation versus adaptation, we've been through this. mitigation on a spatial scale, time scale, and sectors. They're fundamentally different approaches, but we don't talk about them nearly as much as we should. How should we adapt to more and larger wildfires, or bigger and longer droughts, or more floods, or more landslides, or rising seas, or hotter temperatures? The question is, who is we? Some of us have better ability to adapt than others, and it is correlated with our wealth and our income. Not only individually, but also as members of a society. Some societies are better able. Most of the costs and burdens of adaptation are now borne by A, the affected individuals and families, B, the government and taxpayers, or C, insurers and other for-profit entities, or D, nonprofits, charitable institutions. Most. Overwhelmingly, 74% say the affected individuals and families. And I think you're right, but it's important to understand how much increasingly government, taxpayers, insurers, and others are also bearing some of these costs. For example, if you look at public spending on wildfires, fighting wildfires in California, this again goes only up to 2018, but the public cost, that is taxpayers, are paying more and more. Ultimately, taxpayers are individuals, obviously, but it is more and more of public budgets. The National Flood Insurance Programs, part of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, well, households in 100-year floodplains that do not have subsidized National Flood Insurance Program coverage, well, most of them are low-income people. Most of those who get subsidized, and it is subsidized, insurance are higher income. But the fact that you have a National Flood Insurance Program at all indicates that taxpayers are paying it. Federal disaster relief. We don't really talk about this as a country, but disaster relief going up steadily. This is a cost all of us are bearing in one way or another. It means that we can't do other things. But most of the burden on adaptation still falls on the poor because they get hit with it directly. Why? Because they live in the most fragile housing, most susceptible to climate disasters. B, they live in locations most vulnerable to climate disasters. Or C, they can't afford private insurance to cover the cost of climate disasters. Or D, they lack the political clout to get public action. Most of you, it's about 52%, think they live in locations most vulnerable to climate disasters. Well, certainly that is true. All of these, to some extent, are true. What do the data show? Well, the data show that it really is mostly A but B, but it's very, very close also to A. That is, you get many climate disasters that tear people's homes apart. One of the most important reasons why people get injured with tornadoes, with hurricanes and so forth, is they live in very fragile housing. But obviously, to a large extent, they also can't afford private insurance. In fact, if you look at what the wealthy or the relatively wealthy can do and are doing to adapt higher income households, they don't live in trailers or fragile housing. They also live, for the most part, above floodplains. And also, they buy private insurance to cover losses. Every year, I am given an option to buy more and more insurance, and to the extent that I can, I do, buy power generators, or good air conditioning, or water filters, or bottled water. All of these are things that higher income people do to cope with emergencies. And have second homes to escape to if the wildfires become out of control. Or you saw with COVID, some of the wealthiest people in America, what did they do? They went on their yachts. The point is that adaptation is relatively easy if you have the means to adapt. This is where climate justice or injustice or environmental justice or injustice very much comes in. And then, of course, there's the question here, do you want incentives for people to move if they possibly can afford it? That is, should there be insurance at all for floodplains? Should there be disaster assistance? This raises the whole question of moral hazard that we've talked about before, in which people aren't accountable for the results of their decision-making. And there is a strong current of opinion that says government should not be bailing people out for bad decisions. Now, that's easy to say with regard to middle-income people or high-income people, but how about poor people who can't afford to be anywhere else? Which gets us to the final unit today, which is mitigating. And as I said, adapting is different from mitigating. Mitigating is actually reducing climate change to the extent possible. Where are most carbon emissions coming from? A, developing nations, which have huge populations and have to rely on wood, coal, and other carbon sources of energy, or B, China and India, which are using huge amounts of energy in pursuit of rapid growth. Some people call them developing nations. For this purpose, I'm not. C, developed nations, which have become accustomed to oil, gas, coal, and other forms of dirty energy. What do you think? Go. And let's take a look at what you think. Well, the vast majority of you, 61%, say it's mostly coming from developed nations, which have become dependent on oil, gas, and coal. Interesting question, interesting case in point is Russian oil and gas exports right now. I don't know if you've been following this particular strand of news, but it is apparent that sanctions, economic sanctions on Russia with regard to its aggression, its brutal aggression in Ukraine, are not working. To the extent that Putin is still able to finance his war. And the new and most recent thinking is that they're not working because as Putin aggresses, the price of oil and gas is going up, and Russia's oil and gas exports are delivering even more money to Russia. And so the only way of really causing pain to Putin is to eliminate and not buy Russian oil and gas. Easy to say. But much of Europe, particularly Germany, is dependent on Russian oil and gas. And because it's a world market, by the way, if we stop buying Russian oil and gas, it would drive prices higher in the United States. Well, some people would say in response, yes, that's a sacrifice. It's a sacrifice we should be making. The people of Ukraine are sacrificing their lives. Well, other people say in response to that, but we would be making huge sacrifices. And then the we, of course, is who is actually going to make the biggest sacrifices in places like the United States. It is people who are the poorest. And then the response to that very often is, but wait a minute, we went through the Second World War and we all sacrificed in a fairly equitable way. How did we do that in terms of fuel and food? How did we do that? We used something that nobody would ever even utter the word any longer. And the word is rationing. That's what we did when we had to sacrifice and we wanted to do it equitably. We rationed. That's what other countries did. We also had another thing, two words that nobody utters now, but I'm going to utter them for you. But don't tell anybody I told you. Price controls. Shh. Rationing and price controls were the way we spread the burden of sacrifice in World War II. It's possible, hard. The world's top emitters of carbon dioxide, China is the biggest, the United States is the second biggest. But this doesn't tell you about the per person cost, does it? Because in the United States, the average person in the United States is much wealthier than the average person in China. Let's look at that if we can. The world's top emitters by per capita wealth. And up here you see, I'm going to look at the world's richest 10%. Down here is the world's poorest 50%. The percentage of CO2 emissions, the richest 10% are responsible for almost half of total lifestyle consumption emissions. The poorest 50% are responsible for only around 10%. And China is somewhere here. It's not in the richest 10%. In fact, if you look at the richest of the richest 10% per capita and ask the biggest emitters of pollutants by world wealth, it's the United States. So who is most vulnerable to climate change? Not surprisingly, it is low-income countries, and they are becoming increasingly vulnerable to climate change. We haven't talked in this class very much about global poverty, global injustice, but we could, especially in issues like this. Connecting the dots, climate change, inequality, instability, violence. I don't want to get too lost in the weeds here, but I just want to make sure you know that as the climate changes, as there's less arable land and potable water, as certain regions of the world, like sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East, become parched, what happens in terms of the people who are there? Well, they have to compete more intensely for whatever land and resources are available, and they also find themselves in the midst of more and more violence that may or may not be related, certainly correlated, to these scarcities, which are in turn related to more migration. Is there so much migration going on? Well, it's not just wonderful opportunities in Europe or the United States. It's that people are leaving because there is violence, or they can't make it, or they're starving. You see how all these are related. The Paris pledges, well, this is business as usual in terms of gigatons of CO2. These are the Paris pledges. The United States is, let's say, off the mark, not doing all that well, close to business as usual. What about a Green New Deal? What happened to that? Why hasn't Biden done more? He tried lots of climate measures in his failed Build Back Better plan, but West Virginia's Senator Joe Manchin torpedoed it. Or B, the American public still isn't prepared to make the sacrifices required. Or C, big oil and coal put up lots of money into lobbying and campaign donations against any fundamental shift toward clean energy. What do you think? What's the major factor? Well, most of you think it's big oil and coal and all of their lobbying efforts. Well, let's see. All of these are correct to some extent. There's no clear answer, but one answer seems to be more clear than others, or clearer than others. So the public is changing its views. So it's not that the public is not with us. In fact, the public is, climate is changing, percent who believe global warming is happening in the United States. Well, we see quite a big change. More and more Americans say it is happening. These are those who deny it. Climate deniers are not really growing. And in terms of why is it changing? Well, we see more and more are saying that it is because of human beings, not because of natural non-human forces. So you've got more and more understanding in the United States of the forces of climate change, and most in favor of solar and wind. Most Americans now, interestingly, are in favor of more solar farms, more wind turbines. It's getting quite popular. This is not something the politicians should worry about necessarily. But then you look at the annual expenditures on lobbying, and we might include here also under the term lobbying political donations of the oil and gas companies. As you said, they're very substantial. So in a way, it's a race between public opinion and lobbying. Some good news, electricity generation keeps on, at least coal, keeps on dropping, and you have more hydro, more wind. It is certainly the trend. It's a race between these sort of natural or non-carbon sources and the world environment. Inequality cannot be separated from the environment. Where you live does matter. The poor, disproportionately, Black people, Latinx, Native American, are particularly imperiled by toxins in the environment. Climate change is starting to be viewed as a problem for all of us. But climate change, environmental justice is a real, daily phenomenon. Thank you.